There's a peculiar solace in silence, especially the kind that surrounds you in the dead of night when the world outside has settled into its rhythm. In those quiet hours, I've often found myself contemplating the mysteries of existence not in the way a philosopher might, with sweeping theories, but as someone who has lived long enough to recognize patterns in the seemingly chaotic dance of life. I'm not a young man anymore. The years have etched lines into my face and wisdom into my soul. They've given me the gift of hindsight, the ability to look back and see the threads that have woven my life into the tapestry it is today. And one thread, in particular, has always stood out to me: the strange, undeniable connection between the grand expanse of the universe and the intimate world within us. The first time I felt this connection, I was just a boy, lying on the grass of my grandfather's farm in Kansas. The sky above me was a vast, endless ocean of stars, shimmering in patterns I couldn't understand but instinctively knew were important. My grandfather, a man of few words but boundless wisdom, sat beside me, his pipe glowing faintly in the darkness. "Look at the stars, son," he said, his voice as steady as the earth beneath us. "They ain't just out there for show. They're tellin' a story about you, me, and everything in between." At the time, I didn't grasp the depth of his words. To me, the stars were just pinpricks of light, distant and indifferent. But as I grew older, I began to notice the patterns he spoke of, the same cycles that governed the heavens, the changing seasons. The phases of the moon seemed to echo within me. My moods rose and fell like the tides. My life unfolded in seasons of its own. Years later, as a young man with a thirst for knowledge, I stumbled upon a passage in an old book that struck me like a bolt of lightning. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of the ages. As above, so below; as within, so without. The words were attributed to the Emerald Tablet, an ancient text shrouded in mystery and legend. At the time, I didn't understand their full meaning, but they resonated with something deep inside me, like a melody I'd heard before but couldn't place. Life, as it tends to do, pulled me in 1,000 directions after that. I married, raised children, worked long hours, and chased the dreams we're told to chase. But no matter how busy or distracted I became, those words lingered in the back of my mind, whispering their truth. It wasn't until much later, after retirement offered me the luxury of time, that I began to truly explore the connection between the world above and the world within. What I discovered wasn't just a philosophical idea but a living, breathing truth, a truth that revealed itself in the most unexpected ways. For example, have you ever noticed how the veins in a leaf mirror the rivers that carve through the earth? Or how the spiral of a seashell echoes the swirling galaxies in the night sky? These are not coincidences. They are reflections, reminders that we are not separate from the universe but an integral part of it. I began to see these patterns everywhere, in everything. The same forces that shape the cosmos shape us as well. The iron in our blood, they say, was forged in the heart of a dying star. And if the stars are our ancestors, then surely the universe is our home. As I sit here now, writing these words, I am reminded of my grandfather's voice, steady and wise. He didn't have a college education or scientific training, but he understood something that took me decades to fully grasp. The world above and the world within are one and the same. So here we are, you and I, at the beginning of a journey, not a journey outward, into the vastness of space, but inward, into the depths of our own existence. For if the universe truly is a mirror, then to understand it, we must first understand ourselves. And that, my friend, is where the real adventure begins. There's a quiet kind of beauty in old things books with their faded covers, stories handed down through generations, and truths that seem to echo from a time before memory. I've always found comfort in such things, not because they offer easy answers, but because they hold the weight of lives lived and lessons learned. It was a brisk autumn morning when I first stumbled upon the old temple. I had taken a trip to the countryside, seeking a retreat from the hum of modern life. as I walked the narrow, winding paths lined with maple trees aflame with red and gold. I noticed a crumbling stone archway tucked into the hillside. The arch was barely visible beneath layers of moss, but something about it called to me. Inside, I found what could only be described as a sanctuary forgotten by time. The air was cool and still, heavy with the scent of earth and age. In the center of the space sat a low altar carved from a single piece of marble, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively understood to be ancient. Around the altar, shelves of books lined the walls, their spines cracked and their pages yellowed. As I ran my fingers over the worn covers, one book in particular caught my eye. Its title was faint, almost illegible, The Hermetic Path. I opened it, and the words on the first page stopped me cold. As above, so below as within, so without. The microcosm and the macrocosm are reflections of the same eternal truth. There it was again, those words that had haunted me for so many years, now staring back at me from the pages of an ancient text. I settled into one of the wooden chairs, its surface smooth from decades, perhaps centuries, of use, and began to read. The book spoke of principles that felt both familiar and foreign. It described the universe as a great, living organism, with every part connected to the whole. It spoke of fractals, patterns that repeat themselves in infinite scales, and how these patterns could be seen in everything from the spiral of a galaxy to the veins in a leaf. It spoke of the human spirit as a reflection of the divine, a spark of the infinite housed within the finite. But it was not just the content of the book that struck me. It was the feeling it evoked. It was as though I was not simply reading but remembering, as if these ideas had always been a part of me, waiting to be unearthed. I spent hours in that temple, lost in the words and the silence. The more I read, the more I felt a strange sense of clarity. It was as though the veil between the world I had always known and something much greater was beginning to lift. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the stone floor, an elderly man entered the room. He moved with a quiet grace, his steps deliberate and unhurried. His face was lined with age, his eyes sharp and bright. He introduced himself simply as Elias. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I told him about my lifelong curiosity, my search for meaning in the connection between the vastness of the cosmos and the intimacy of the human experience. Elias listened without interruption, nodding occasionally as I spoke. When I finished, he smiled a knowing, almost mischievous smile. "You seek understanding," he said. "But understanding is not found in books or theories. It is found in experience. The stars do not ponder their place in the heavens. They simply shine. Perhaps it is the same for us." He led me outside, where the night sky stretched endlessly above us. The stars were bright and clear, their light undimmed by the distractions of modern life. Elias gestured upward. "Do you see them?" he asked. "Each star is a world unto itself, yet together they form constellations, patterns that have guided travelers for millennia. So it is with us. Each of us is a world, unique and whole, yet we are also part of something much greater. The key is to see both." His words settled over me like a warm blanket on a cold night. For the first time, I felt not just an intellectual understanding but a deep, unshakable knowing. The truth I had been searching for was not something to be discovered, but something to be remembered. I returned to my small cottage that evening with the book in hand and a new sense of purpose. Life, I realized, is not about finding answers, but about living the questions. It is about seeing the patterns, not as mere coincidences, but as clues, a map leading us back to ourselves. As I write this now, I think of Elias and his quiet wisdom. He didn't offer me solutions or certainties, but something far more valuable, the reminder that the world above and the world within are one and the same, and that in understanding one, we can begin to understand the other. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes it's in the softness of a sunrise, or the way an old friend's laughter feels like home. And sometimes, it's in the cold, unyielding precision of a scientific diagram. For me, it was the latter, an ordinary afternoon spent leafing through an old book on astronomy that bridged the chasm between what I thought I knew and what I hadn't yet dared to believe. The diagram was simple: a swirling galaxy, its spiraled arms stretching out into infinity. Below it, another image, a nautilus shell, its chambers curling inward with the same elegant precision. Side by side, they were mirror images, though separated by scales so vast it felt impossible. One was a cosmic dance of stars and planets, the other a home for a humble sea creature. Yet the pattern was the same. I stared at the page for what felt like hours. This was no accident. This was a whisper from the universe, a nudge to look deeper. The book didn't elaborate much, just a brief note about the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern found in everything from flower petals to hurricanes. But it planted a seed in my mind, a question I couldn't shake. Why do these patterns repeat? Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep indigo, I stepped outside and let the quiet envelop me. The stars above twinkled with an indifference that was oddly comforting. I thought about how those same stars had guided sailors across oceans, inspired poets to dream, and now, in their quiet persistence, they were asking me to see them anew. It wasn't long before I found myself diving into books and lectures, exploring everything from quantum mechanics to ancient philosophy. I learned how fractals, a concept once relegated to abstract mathematics, described not just the structure of galaxies but also the intricate branching of our own blood vessels. The same patterns, over and over again, from the vastness of space to the intimacy of our own bodies. But the real revelation came one rainy afternoon in a dusty library. I had stumbled upon a paper by a physicist named David Bohm. He described the universe not as a collection of separate parts but as an undivided whole. He compared reality to a hologram, where every fragment contains the image of the entire picture. In essence, the whole universe could be found within even the tiniest particle. I remember sitting back in my chair, letting the idea wash over me. It was beautiful, wasn't it? The thought that we are not isolated beings floating aimlessly in a vast, indifferent cosmos, but rather reflections of it. Every heartbeat, every thought, every moment of connection, they were all echoes of something infinitely larger. Of course, not everyone saw it this way. I mentioned these ideas to a friend once, a retired engineer with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. He waved me off with a dismissive laugh. "Patterns are just coincidences," he said. "Nothing mystical about them. It's all math and physics." He wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Patterns are math and physics. But they are also something more. They are the fingerprints of a universe that is both rational and poetic, logical and deeply mysterious. Science, I had come to realize, doesn't diminish the wonder of existence, it magnifies it. Take DNA, for instance, those tiny, twisting molecules that hold the blueprint for life itself. They are a fractal, to a pattern that contains the instructions for an entire organism within every microscopic cell. It's as if the universe itself whispers, "Look closely. Everything you need to know is already within you." These days, I often find myself returning to the quiet wisdom of that thought. Whether I'm watching a leaf fall in perfect spirals or marveling at the intricate lines on my hands, I'm reminded that we are both the observer and the observed. The stars may seem far away, but their light, formed millions of years ago, now reaches us, illuminating not just the night sky but the depths of our own existence. So here we are, standing at the intersection of science and philosophy, where equations meet poetry and the physical world reveals its spiritual counterpart. It's not a place of answers, but of questions. And perhaps that's the point. For as much as I've learned, the most profound realization has been this: understanding the universe begins not with solving its mysteries but with embracing its wonder. And if you, like me, have ever looked at the stars and felt both infinitely small and deeply connected, then you already know what I mean. The universe doesn't just exist outside of us, it lives within us. All we have to do is pay attention. There comes a moment in every life when the noise of the world fades, and we are left with nothing but ourselves. For me, that moment came one winter evening, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones and the silence feels almost sacred. I was sitting by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, when I realized something that had been quietly waiting for me all along. If the universe is a reflection, then the answers I sought were not out there among the stars but within me. I wish I could tell you that realization brought me peace. It did not at first. The idea of looking inward was far more daunting than any external journey. It's easy to marvel at the vastness of the cosmos or the intricacies of nature. But to turn that same gaze inward? That's another matter entirely. I had always thought of myself as a logical man, someone who sought answers through reason and evidence. But life, as it often does, had a way of teaching me lessons I wasn't ready to learn. The first lesson came in the form of stillness. It started with meditation, something I'd dismissed for years as impractical and indulgent. But one afternoon, with nothing but time on my hands and a restless mind, I decided to give it a try. I sat in my living room, the soft hum of the heater in the background, and closed my eyes. At first, felt ridiculous. My thoughts darted from one worry to the next, like unruly children refusing to sit still. But then, slowly, something shifted. The chaos quieted. And for the briefest of moments, there was a stillness that felt vast and timeless. That stillness, I realized, was the same as the silence of the night sky. It was infinite and yet contained entirely within me. I began to see my thoughts and emotions not as who I was but as passing clouds in a much larger sky. It was both humbling and freeing to recognize that I was more than the sum of my fears and desires. The more I explored this inner landscape, the more connections I began to see. I noticed how my moods mirrored the cycles of the moon, waxing with excitement, waning with introspection. I saw how my thoughts rippled outward, affecting the people around me, much like a pebble dropped into a still pond. And I began to understand, in a way I never had before, that the world I experienced was shaped as much by what was inside me as by what was outside. One evening, I found myself thinking back to my grandfather's farm. I remembered the way he tended to his crops, with a patience that I hadn't appreciated as a child. He used to say, "You can't rush growth. You plant the seed, and then you nurture it. The rest is up to the earth." It struck me then that the same was true for the mind and spirit. The seeds we plant, our thoughts, intentions, and beliefs determine the harvest of our lives. I began to pay more attention to the seeds I was planting. Were my thoughts rooted in fear or love? Were my intentions aligned with the kind of life I wanted to create? These questions became a quiet mantra, guiding me as I navigated the days. And over time, I noticed something remarkable. The world around me seemed to change. It wasn't that life became easier or that challenges disappeared, but there was a harmony to it, a sense of flow that I hadn't felt before. Even on the hardest days, there was a quiet assurance that I was part of something much greater than myself, a thread in the vast tapestry of existence. One night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars, a thought came to me with a clarity that felt like a gift. The world within shapes the world without. It's a simple truth, really, but one that we so often forget in the rush of daily life. We spend so much time trying to change our circumstances, yet the real transformation begins within us. So now, as I write these words, I invite you to pause for a moment, take a deep breath and let it settle. Think of the sky, vast and unchanging, and know that the same vastness exists within you. The stars above may light the way, but it is the light within that guides us home. Life has a rhythm, though we often lose sight of it amid the noise of our busy days. But if you've ever watched the seasons change or listened to the steady cadence of waves crashing against the shore, you've felt it. This rhythm isn't just around us, it's within us. It's the pulse of something ancient, a reminder that life moves in cycles, and we are part of those cycles, whether we realize it or not. I first noticed this rhythm on a spring morning long ago, standing in my garden, The snow had only just melted, leaving behind a damp, fertile earth that smelled of renewal. Tiny green shoots were pushing their way through the soil, fragile but determined. As I bent down to inspect them, I was struck by a thought so simple yet so profound it left me speechless. Everything grows in its time. It's a truth I'd seen play out in nature countless times. Seeds are planted, nurtured by sun and rain, and eventually bear fruit. Then, just as inevitably, the fruit falls, the plants wither, and the cycle begins again. It's a pattern as old as the earth itself. Yet I had never thought to apply it to my own life. For years, I had resisted the cycles within me. I wanted to be in perpetual summer, always growing, always thriving. I saw rest and reflection as weaknesses, seasons to be rushed through on the way to something more productive. But standing in that garden, watching the fragile beauty of new life emerging, I realized how much I had been missing. Our lives, like the earth, move through seasons. There are times of planting, where we lay the groundwork for future growth, times of harvest, when we reap the rewards of our efforts, and times of winter, where we rest and gather strength for the next cycle. Each season has its purpose, its lessons. Ignoring them doesn't stop the cycle, it only leaves us unprepared for what comes next. This realization became especially clear to me in the years after retirement. For decades, I had defined myself by what I did, my work, my accomplishments, the roles I played in my family and community. But as those roles shifted and fell away, I found myself in an unexpected winter. It was a season of stillness, one that forced me to confront questions I had avoided for most of my life. Who am I when the doing stops? What remains when the roles are gone? First, it was an uncomfortable silence. Without the noise of daily obligations, I was left alone with my thoughts, my regrets, my hopes. But as the days stretched into weeks, something remarkable began to happen. In the quiet, I started to hear the rhythm of my own life. It was faint at first, like a distant drumbeat, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. I realized that just as nature rests in winter, so too did I need this time of reflection. It wasn't an ending, as I had feared, but a necessary pause before a new beginning. The lessons I had learned in my earlier seasons, the patience of spring, the diligence of summer, the gratitude of autumn were still with me, shaping the way I approached this new chapter. And just as winter always gives way to spring, so too did my season of rest lead to renewal. I began to explore new interests, reconnect with old friends, and find joy in the small, quiet moments that I had once overlooked. The rhythm of life, I discovered, wasn't something to fight or control. It was something to embrace. These days, when I walk through my garden or watch the changing leaves, I am reminded of the cycles that shape us all. They are not just in nature, they are in our relationships, our work, our very being. They remind us that growth and rest are equally important, that endings are also beginnings, and that even in our darkest winters, the promise of spring is never far away. So if you find yourself in a season that feels unfamiliar or difficult, I encourage you to take a moment to listen. Feel the rhythm of your life, the quiet pulse that connects you to the earth, the stars, and everything in between. Trust that the season you are in has its purpose, and that, in time, the cycle will turn again. There's a curious thing about limits, they feel so real until they don't. Whether it's a physical boundary, an unspoken rule, or a self-imposed belief, we live our lives within invisible fences that seem immovable. But every now and then, something shifts. We glimpse the world beyond, and suddenly, the fences fall away. I learned this lesson in the most unexpected way. It wasn't during a great moment of triumph or clarity, but rather on a quiet evening, sitting alone on my back porch. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the horizon was painted in shades of deep purple and gold. I was thinking about all the things I'd once believed were impossible, dreams I'd set aside, paths I hadn't dared to take. And for the first time, I wondered, were those limits real, or had I built them myself? You see, For most of my life, I prided myself on being practical. I valued hard work and sensible choices, the kind that kept food on the table and a roof over our heads. But looking back, I could see how that practicality had sometimes turned into fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of stepping too far outside the familiar. One memory in particular stood out. It was the year I turned 50, and my oldest daughter invited me to join her on a hiking trip through the Rockies. At first, I laughed at the idea. I hadn't been on a trail in decades, let alone climbed a mountain. That's not for me, I told her, listing a dozen reasons why it wasn't practical or safe. But she wouldn't let it go. Come on, Dad, she said. You might surprise yourself. Reluctantly, I agreed, though I spent the weeks leading up to the trip bracing for failure. When the day came, the climb was every bit as grueling as I'd feared. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and there were moments when I was certain I couldn't take another step. But then, something happened. As we reached the summit, the struggle faded away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. The view stretched on forever, peaks and valleys bathed in sunlight. Clouds so close you felt you could touch them. It wasn't just beautiful. It was humbling. Standing there, I realized how small my fears had been in the face of something so vast. The limits I'd imposed on myself, the ones that had seemed so solid, were nothing more than shadows. That experience stayed with me, a quiet reminder that the fences we build are often of our own making. And while they may feel safe, they also keep us from growing. It's not the limits themselves that define us, but how we choose to respond to them. As I grew older, I began to test those fences more often. Sometimes it was in small ways, saying yes to an invitation I might have declined or trying something new just for the joy of it. Other times, it meant confronting deeper fears, the kind that had been with me for years. Each time, I found that the limits weren't as immovable as I'd thought. They bent, stretched, and sometimes disappeared entirely. There's a freedom that comes with this realization, one that's not about recklessness or defiance but about trust. Trust in your own resilience, in the lessons life has taught you, and in the knowledge that growth often comes from stepping into the unknown. I've come to see limits not as barriers but as thresholds. They are the places where we are asked to pause, to reflect, and to decide whether we are ready to step through. And while the step may be uncertain, it is also where transformation begins. So here's what I would say to you, dear reader, whatever limits you face, know that they are not the end of the road. They are simply markers, reminders of how far you've come and how much farther you can go. Whether you're climbing a mountain, starting a new chapter, or simply daring to dream again, the journey is always worth it. And when you look back, you might just find that the fences you thought were so solid were never really there at all. There's a quiet truth I've come to understand in my later years. The world we see and the world we feel are not as separate as they seem. For much of my life, I treated them as though they were. I saw the physical, the daily grind, the bills, the aches and pains of a body growing older as one realm, and the spiritual, the moments of connection, the longing for meaning as something entirely different. But time, with its patient wisdom, has taught me otherwise. It began with a small, seemingly insignificant moment. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a box of old photographs. The faces smiled back at me from years long past, my children as toddlers, my wife in her favorite summer dress, my own younger self with more hair and fewer lines. Each photo was a snapshot of a time that felt both distant and immediate, a reminder of how much had changed and yet, somehow, stayed the same. One photo in particular caught my eye. It was a picture of my grandmother standing in her garden, a basket of tomatoes in her hands. She had always been a woman of the earth, her days marked by the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and nurturing the land. Yet, for all her practicality, there was something deeply spiritual about the way she moved through the world. She often spoke of the soil as if it were alive, a partner in the work rather than a resource to be used. "It's all connected," she would say, her voice steady and sure. The earth feeds us, and we care for it. The body and the spirit, the work and the prayer, they're all part of the same song. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. To me, her words were simply the musings of an old woman. But as I sat there at the table, holding that photograph, I began to see her wisdom in a new light. Her garden wasn't just a place where vegetables grew. It was a reflection of her spirit. The care she put into the soil, the patience she showed as seeds sprouted and bloomed, it was all a mirror of the care and patience she brought to her relationships. Her faith, her life, she didn't separate the physical from the spiritual. She wove them together, seamlessly, like threads in a tapestry. It made me wonder how often I had missed the harmony between the two in my own life. How many times had I dismissed the small, mundane acts, folding laundry, washing dishes, planting flowers, as merely tasks, when they were opportunities to engage with something deeper. How often had I overlooked the way a quiet walk in the woods could soothe not just my body but my soul. Over the years, I began to pay more attention to these moments. I noticed how the steady rhythm of chopping vegetables could feel like a meditation, or how the warmth of the sun on my face during a morning stroll could awaken a sense of gratitude. I realized that the spiritual didn't have to be grand or otherworldly. It could be found in the simplest of acts, in the way we move through the world and the care we bring to our daily lives. This shift in perspective changed the way I saw myself. 2. I stopped thinking of my body as something separate from who I was, as merely a vehicle for my mind and spirit, and started seeing it as an integral part of my being. Just as the soil needed tending, so did my body. And just as the seasons shaped the land, so too did they shape me. I began to treat my body with the same reverence my grandmother had shown her garden. I ate more thoughtfully, moved more gently, and rested more intentionally, not because I wanted to live forever, but because I wanted to live fully, in harmony with the rhythm of my life. Looking back now, I can see how much I've grown, not just in understanding but in being. The lines between spirit and matter, between the sacred and the ordinary, have blurred in the most beautiful way. Life, I've come to realize, isn't about choosing one or the other. It's about embracing both, about finding the sacred in the everyday and the everyday in the sacred. So as I write these words, I think of you, my reader, sitting wherever you are. Maybe you're sipping a cup of coffee or watching the sun dip below the horizon. Whatever moment you're in, I hope you can see the beauty in it. I hope you can feel the connection between the breath you take and the life you live, between the world outside and the world within. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the harmony we seek is already here. It's in the soil beneath our feet, the air we breathe, the hands we hold. It's in the way we care for ourselves and for each other, in the quiet moments when we stop and listen to the song of life. And when we finally see it, when we truly embrace the unity of spirit and matter, we become part of that song, adding our own notes to the eternal melody. In the twilight of life, as the days grow quieter and the pace of the world seems to quicken without us, there is a stillness that invites reflection. I often find myself sitting by the window as the evening light softens the edges of the world, thinking about the path I've walked and the lessons that have followed me like shadows. One truth, above all, has revealed itself to me in countless ways. Life is a mirror. It reflects back not just what we do, but who we are, our thoughts, our actions. Even the quietest of intentions, they all ripple outward, shaping the world around us and, in turn, shaping us. I came to understand this slowly, over a lifetime of moments that at first seemed unrelated. There was the time I spoke harshly to a friend and saw the hurt reflected in their eyes, or the time I offered kindness to a stranger and felt the warmth of their gratitude in return. Each of these moments, whether painful or beautiful, was a lesson. What we put into the world, we get back. But this idea goes deeper than actions and their consequences. It's about how we perceive the world itself. For years, I saw life as something that happened to me, a series of events, some good, some bad, that I had little control over. I didn't realize that my perspective was shaping my experience, like a lens coloring everything I saw. It wasn't until much later, during a particularly difficult season of my life, that I began to see things differently. I was struggling with loss, feeling adrift and powerless. One evening, I found myself staring into a mirror, not just glancing, but really looking. The person staring back at me seemed a stranger, worn and weary, and yet, there was something familiar in their eyes, something that reminded me of the stars I had gazed at as a child, a quiet resilience, a spark of light even in the darkness. In that moment, I realized that the way I saw myself was the way I saw the world. If I believed I was broken, the world would seem harsh and unforgiving. But if I could see even a glimmer of strength or hope within myself, perhaps I could find it in the world, too. This shift in perspective didn't change my circumstances overnight, but it did change the way I moved through them. I began to notice the small moments of beauty that I had overlooked, the way the morning sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter in the distance, the comfort of a kind word from a friend. These weren't just distractions from the difficulties of life. They were reminders of its depth and richness. And as I changed the way I saw the world began to reflect that change back to me. I found myself meeting people who inspired me, experiencing moments of unexpected grace, and feeling a sense of connection to something far greater than myself. Now, as I sit here with pen in hand, I think about the journey we all take, the steps, the stumbles, the pauses to catch our breath. Life, I've learned, isn't about avoiding the difficult parts or rushing through the quiet moments. It's about seeing each experience as part of a larger whole, a reflection of the vast, interconnected web that we are all a part of. So, my dear reader, as you reflect on your own journey, I invite you to look into the mirror of your life. What does it show you? Perhaps it reveals a strength you didn't know you had, or a beauty you've overlooked. Perhaps it reminds you that the light you see in others is the same light that burns within you. The mirror doesn't lie, but it also doesn't judge. It simply reflects. And in that reflection, we can find both clarity and compassion: clarity to see things as they are, and compassion to embrace them as part of the ever-unfolding story of our lives. As the day fades and the stars begin to emerge, I am reminded of something my grandmother once said: "The world gives back what you give to it, so give it your best, even on the hardest days." It's a simple truth, but one that has guided me through more than I can say. And now, as I pass it on to you, I hope it brings the same quiet strength and comfort that it has brought to me. For in the end, life is not about what we take from it, but what we give to it and how, in giving, we come to see ourselves reflected in its endless, shimmering light.